Well, good morning. I am glad that I can be here for this passage, a passage which at times can disturb us and is complicated, and so they gave it to me, I guess, because we in the missions background understand complicated things. So I will do my best to give us something to chew on today, but we won't skip over the complicated parts that come in this passage, but we'll just go for it. I'm talking today about the gospel is for all peoples. The gospel is for all peoples. And let's remember as we read Mark that this was written in a time when the church was very new. And it's written to the church, even though the gospel, you think of it as the good news, and that this is telling others the story of Jesus. But this is also reminding the church what they believe and who they are. And in this time, maybe just a generation past the time of Jesus, when these people are mixed between Gentiles and Jews gathering together in places all throughout the region, and they're getting this letter from Mark, this story. As we read through this, how surprised they would be by the different characters and what's happening, because some things are expected, and then some things that happen are so unexpected. But in this, they are reminded again that the gospel is for all peoples. So we begin with an interchange, a little bit of conflict, a little bit of tension between the Pharisees and some scribes or teachers of the law as they gather around Jesus. And they come to him and they're so perplexed. How can your disciples eat with unclean hands, with defiled hands? And they go on to question him in this. But let's remember some of the things here. It's not in their mind. There's some of this is religious, but some of this is also socio-political. They are in this time where they're the time of Jesus. They've added all these traditions to what it means to be Jewish, and some of the key things that they highlight are observing the Sabbath, circumcision, and food laws, which is here in this story. It's the food laws, to identify themselves as Jewish. This is who they are. And in a time where being Jewish is such an identity of where you've come from, they can account to their Jewishness from they were born from this family and this family, this family, and it goes on. The purity of their Jewishness. And so some of what they're questioning here isn't just that Jesus isn't following the law to be clean and holy before God, but is he even one of us? He's not identifying himself as one of us here. What's going on with this? And in Jesus' mind, this doesn't have anything to do with food at all. And there's a lot we could get into, but I want to get into the story of the encounter with the woman in Tyre. But Jesus talks about it's not what goes into you that defiles you, but what comes out of your heart. It's not what goes into you that defiles you, but what comes out of your heart. And so they're questioning what is pure Jewishness, what is pure, what is purity. And sometimes I think we struggle with these issues. What does it mean to be Christian? What does it mean? And sometimes they're unintentional. They're just so-called natural. We end up having idioms like the pastor will pastor a church that ends up looking like himself or possibly herself if it's not a male pastor, but the pastor will pastor a church that looks like who they are. And that's a maxim because it's often practically what happens. But that just shows that we, another American idiom, birds of a feather flock together. And so we use these things to justify the fact that we do things as we all gather and be like ourselves. And the gospel should challenge some of those notions, some of those things that are just so-called natural. And as I'm coming back to Leslie Newbegin for another reason and reading Foolishness to Greeks, he's reminding us of how the culture that we live in today includes the church, includes the Bible. And so how do we then allow the church and the Bible to challenge ourselves when in so many ways it's become a part of who we are. And so when we come to the gospel, we should be expecting there to be things that speak to us in a way that disturbs us, that calls us out. And that being together in a cultural location isn't just about being with people that look like me. And then we get to, like, as I mentioned earlier, missions. I have a missions background and missionary. I didn't always think that was going to happen. When I was in college, I was sure that I wasn't going to be a missionary. And I avoided others, girls that were telling me they were called to be a missionary, because that wasn't for me. But I remember this one time, I had an encounter with somebody. I was an intern one year in Seattle, and this nice person in the church was talking to me over dinner, and he says, "You'd make a good missionary." And I'm thinking, why is that? And he says, because you can't see, so you wouldn't have prejudices the same as those of us who can see. And as I've been reflecting on that, preparing for this morning, I remember just going, I don't want to be a missionary at the time. Like, I wasn't really thinking about how much he was saying, but that's a really odd statement, that you wouldn't have prejudice because you can't see people. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I just don't think that, I do know we do have prejudice based on things we see, but I don't think prejudice is a visual thing alone. It's definitely something that comes out of the heart. It's something that comes out of this thing that how we judge is somebody okay for us to socialize with. Because here they're not encountering Jesus and saying his teaching is wrong. They're saying his activity is wrong. He's not somebody we should associate with because he's not being like us. And so Jesus then goes on to talk about the food issue, and it says in verse 19 that in this he declared that all food is clean. And then he goes on to talk about these other sins and so on, which are important. I don't want to underemphasize sin, but this little statement that all food is clean. And then Mark illustrates that as Jesus goes into the region of Tyre. And this is an intentional thing. It's not like Jesus just ends up in Tyre, not sure where he's going. Jesus intentionally sets out to get away. It doesn't explain if he's going away on sabbatical or where he's going or just for leisure because it's a nice coastal town. But he goes away to this place to get away. And I love the phrase that says, at least in the NRSV and some other translations, he could not escape their attention. Like, Jesus is trying to get away, and yet people know that Jesus is there. And somehow they may not know everything that you can end up knowing after spending more time with Jesus or hearing the stories and learning the scriptures, but they know something that Jesus has. Where Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, Isaiah was right in prophesying, you worship me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. So there's this contrast between a people who should be close to God and yet are far from God, and then a people where Jesus can't escape their attention, who want to come close to him. There's this tension going on. And I love that in this place we are surprised by a woman, a Gentile woman, and we'll get into that a little bit more, but this woman, we don't know her name, we don't know much about her, except where she comes from and her concern. But we do know something that's interesting about her story, which happens again and again throughout Mark, is these minor figures often are the ones who are the heroes of the story. Jesus is spending time getting away, and we've got all these different characters, the Pharisees, the scribes that are again and again portrayed in Mark in a certain way. Jesus is a certain character portrayed in a certain way. The disciples, we already heard them asking Jesus, what do you mean it's not what goes into you that makes you unclean, but what comes out of you? And he's like, you also don't understand. So the disciples, especially in Mark, are looked at in this way of very slow to understand. Very slow to understand. But these minor figures, a demon-possessed character in the Gadarenes, a woman with an issue of blood, a blind man towards the end of the story, a blind man who wants Jesus to touch him, a blind man who can see what Jesus offers in the kingdom of God, while the rich young ruler just before that story has no idea. So these figures who we would expect to do things a certain way don't. And yet the minor figures, I think of IMDb, and when I go to check out who's in this movie that I'm watching or listening to, or who's in this thing, and you go to the IMDb page and the cast of characters, and of course the top of the cast is all these stars. The stars are there letting us know who's important. And then way down lower, you've got these people that are often unnamed characters, security guard number one, or trash collector, or whatever. They don't even have a name, which is what we see here. We encounter this over and over in Mark, unnamed minor figures who become the heroes. She's not trained theologically. She's not educated in the way of God. She's not somebody who we know because of where she comes from. She's got the right family name, or she's got the right she's got the right way to get to Jesus. She's not the one who we would expect. And as we go on in this morning, I'd like us to pause and think, as we are in ministry, and we have the opportunity to invest in others, we often are investing our life in others. And are we identifying or selecting those that we'll pour our life in based on the way of the world, who the world would expect to do great things, who the world would expect to be have value, who the world would say, here's who we can pour into? Or do we invest in those who the world would call a minor figure, as commentators talk about the Syrophoenician woman? Do we pour into those who might be overlooked or marginalized? Or do we go to where the margins are and say, this is where the gospel comes alive. This is where the work of Jesus comes alive? In the margins, in the places where people are often overlooked or left out. Well, here we are. Jesus is trying to get away, and he can't escape the attention. And this woman comes to find Jesus because she heard he's there. She's tried everything else. And nothing works. And she knows that Jesus is here. So there's an opportunity. Something can happen. And she comes to find Jesus. And the language is, how about this begging, this falling at his feet, this sense of showing Jesus honor, understanding who he is, that he has, that as Mark talks about over and over again, the kingdom of God is at hand. She may not fully understand what it is theologically in the way that we could talk about it today, but she understands something of it, that she knows that she can come to him and ask and expect something. And so this woman with a demon-possessed girl, or as we heard this morning, an impure spirit, it's nice and tamed down sometimes, and we get from this distance of time and space that it's something. We don't quite know what it is. And I spent 6 years as a missionary in Bangkok, Thailand, and we often encountered impure spirits or demons. And so it wasn't, it's something that still goes on today. And so if you come from places where that's often encountered, this story comes alive in different ways. But for us, sometimes here in America, it seems so sanitized with this impure spirit. So maybe she was sick in some way that they didn't have medicine to identify what it was then, but this impure spirit. But she knew they had no way of fixing her daughter. But Jesus could. And she comes, and the disciples say, Jesus, this woman's here. How should we get rid of her? The disciples are always looking out for Jesus' best interest. And here, here she continues to beg, just like others on the side of the street when Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. And they're saying, quiet, quiet, you're bothering the guy who's got important places to go and big things to do, like speaking in chapel or something. And so, so here's Jesus, and his response to her is so disturbing. We don't know what to do with it. It's not easy to understand. He says to her, now remember, now Mark identifies her at this point even more. He says she's a Greek, a woman. So he goes from very generic to getting more specific, and of Syro-Phoenician origin or Syro-Phoenician birth. So basically he's saying she's a non-Jew, and we know it because we know Jews by birth, and we know her by her birth. She's not from here. And in this region where there's contention between the Jews and those from Tyre and Sidon, where there's this wealth disparity, and the Jews don't like the people from there because of their wealth and because of all this other stuff going on in this time, and there's contention. We have this in our own time of people that we have contention with. Sometimes it's issues of where somebody's from, their birth, their origin, their background. Sometimes it's because of the way we have contention with Hollywood. Oh, what do they have to say that we could listen to? And I mean, whether it's in politics or in religion, sometimes if it's in politics, we say shut up and act. If it's in religion, we say, it's all full of debauchery and foul and all that comes out of Hollywood. And so we have this posture towards people that then creates a barrier and a divide. How can the gospel encounter people when we have this posture? And so as the readers would read this story, and it's nice that we heard the whole thing this morning, now we know where it's going, but as they're reading through it, they would be shocked in this moment. What's going to happen? And then Jesus says to her this disturbing thing of, you wouldn't take the bread for the children and give it to the dogs. And then we quickly go to like my pet dog, who my kids would drop food on accident, and sometimes not on accident, because a pet dog is there. But they don't have pet dogs in this time. They have street dogs. And I knew about street dogs in Bangkok, Thailand. We would have them all the time running through town, through our street, and trying to chase our pet dog. And like, they were trying to survive. And so they're coming for food from time to time. You're not going to give food for the kids to these scavengers. And not only that, dog, it would be a derogatory term. It's still a derogatory term in the Mediterranean today, in the Mediterranean world today. And we don't have time to get into all these examples, but Jesus is saying something disturbing. I don't think this is what Jesus believes. I think Jesus is wanting to see what she'll say. I think Jesus is speaking what he thinks she would expect him to say, because she's brave enough, courageous enough to come and encounter a Jewish man who's not supposed to encounter a Gentile woman, and she's talking to him and pressing the cultural norms. And so Jesus is saying what is culturally normal to say, not right, not okay to say, but Jesus is saying this, pressing her to see what she's going to say in response. And this is what the readers would expect to be said. This is what the people would. And this is what's so disturbing about it, is that it's so normal. It's so common. And yet her response flips it on its head. And she says, yes, but even the dogs can get the crumbs. Even the dogs can have the leftovers. I know, and who knows what else is going on in her mind, but she's just crying out for, give me something. Don't just leave me here. Don't exclude me. Don't leave me out because of this Jewish-Gentile divide. And in many places, Jesus will say, in Mark 2, he will say of those who lower their friend down to Jesus, he notices their faith and his faith and says, your faith has made you well. And other places, the woman with the issue of blood, your faith has made you well. He doesn't say that here. He just says, because of what you said, your daughter is well. He's identifying her faith through all of this narrative, that she's come here to encounter Jesus, and she's seeing through who he is to say, I want what you have to offer me. even if it's the leftovers. I'll take whatever I can get. And it's disturbing, and there's many things that can be disturbing about it. But let it disturb us, and let's not just run through it and go, okay, well, let's try and downplay it or excuse it or let it go. It may be more there than we can grasp, but what we do know is we see a woman who's saying, but I do know what that food is you have to offer. I do know there's something of the kingdom of God here. There's something of the bread of heaven here. There's something of this. And she encounters him. But more than that, what we're seeing in this story is this figure who would be despised or marginalized, pushed to the side, is the one who's the hero. And the ones who would be more at the center of faithful Jewish life are not. And that the religion isn't about one kind of people, but it's about all peoples. The gospel is a gospel for all peoples. And we see it come exponentially further forward as Luke talks about food not being unclean with the story of Cornelius. It goes on and on and on. And we can look back from now to say we should never be making this faith a faith for one kind of people. That our churches shouldn't be about people like me, that we set up places to worship that look like me, that we design them to have middle-class suburban accommodations, and the families, the parents can come and have a break from their kids during the message, and their kids will be well taken care of, and we don't necessarily know what to do with broken families or single moms or all these different things that are happening in our world today. But we've been, for decades, looking at how to build a church that looks a certain way, and we don't have space for those that may be a little bit noisy because of autism or other cognitive disabilities. And we create a space for a certain kind of clean person. We don't say clean religiously, but they're cleaned up. They're not homeless. They shower. They take care of their wife or husband. They've got kids. And we set up church for the kind of person that is culturally acceptable. And this is not a new thing. And so I want to end with this illustration that can leave us pondering as we go. I know our time is quickly escaping, but Aimee Semple McPherson, who founded the Foursquare Church in the 1920s, was an evangelist who traveled across America and Canada, preaching anywhere that anyone would listen. Receiving letters from a woman in Harlem, would go and preach in a black community, even as the white male evangelist wouldn't. She would preach in Jacksonville and break down the barrier that was separating the blacks who could sit over here and the whites who could sit over here, and say, everyone come into the same place. And she had an ethos of inclusion. But she also had, because she preached the old-time religion, which in many ways spoke to a certain part of the culture as a way to go back to our pure roots, that old-time religion. And so the Ku Klux Klan would try and get her to do things too, and they would offer her support, and she would just preach salvation, just preach Jesus. And this one point, they come to her in Los Angeles as she's setting up Angelus Temple, the church that became the founding church of the Foursquare Gospel Church. And they come wearing their robes and hoods. A large number of them come in. And so she quickly has her children, who are normally there in the service being watched on the side, taken to another room, and she's not sure what's going to happen, but she prepares this illustration before this sermon. She's going to talk about judging, and she prepares to confront these people who are supporting her, to speak to them, not to just say, well, anybody can support the work of God, but to say something to these people gathered in her presence, wearing hoods. And she tells this story of a black man, an older black man traveling to a new town, and he's traveling, and he comes across this big, beautiful church building, a place where he can say, I can worship God there. He sees its steeple. It's a beautiful, tall steeple. It's a beautiful white church building. And he walks in, and he wants to worship God in this place. And he can hear the music, and so he enters. And he comes and sits in the back, just wanting to worship. And then somebody comes up to him and says, you cannot worship here. And he says, I just want to worship. I'm not going to do, he doesn't have to say, I'm not going to. He's just saying, but I just want to worship. And they say, you cannot worship here. You can go to the next street over where there's an African-American church. You can go there to worship, but you cannot worship here. So eventually, heart fallen, he goes out, crestfallen, he goes out, and he sits on the white stairs in front of the church building, head in hands, just not sure what to think of this encounter, when another traveler, an older man, doesn't say a lot about who he is, but another man comes walking up to him, but has a twinkle in his eye. He sits down beside him, puts his arm around him, and looks at him with a twinkle in his eye and says, "They won't let me in there either." Sometimes we can make church all about what it means to be American, what it means to be a certain kind of people. And in the end, we leave Jesus out. But the church is a place, the gospel is a place where all peoples are welcome, and all peoples are the same before the cross of Jesus. And so at that place, when Aimee Semple McPherson shared that story before she got into the sermon, these people who all came in with hoods on got up and left. And the legend has it, it's not been verified, but legend has it that they took their hoods off and left them outside the church. Could we allow the gospel to speak to us? That Jesus wants to encounter us and first challenge us. That it's not just about finding people like us that we can have comfortable Bible study with, but that we can encounter God through a diverse beauty that comes to the cross to become a beautiful, unified diversity with Jesus at the center. This is what we see as Jesus encounters a Syrophoenician woman. We see her showing what faith is, and we see Jesus responding to it. Amen.